Secretary General António Guterres, dear partners and friends, good morning, afternoon, and evening to all of you across the world, and thank you for joining the UN Secretary General's annual Town Hall with civil society. I want to acknowledge the diverse, formidable civil society leaders that are online, representing various backgrounds and ages. You are instrumental in the success of our efforts at CSW, especially in this challenging current global context. I also want to recognize in solidarity the tremendous courage that civil society and women's organizations in Ukraine are showing, and to reiterate the importance of ensuring women are represented in all key decision-making processes and humanitarian response in pursuit of peace and security for the people of Ukraine, as well as in Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Yemen, and beyond. Friends, this 66th session of CSW is an important opportunity to make bold decisions to advance gender equality in the context of climate change, environmental degradation, and disasters. We know that climate change is a risk multiplier, exacerbating existing gender inequalities and undermining women's and girls' rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. It is only through ambitious, cross-cutting, and intersectoral actions that we can address the climate crises and fulfill, and fulfill the goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Beijing Platform for Action. The discussions and networking during CSW will be a chance to further advance the work of the Generation Equality Action Coalition on feminist action for climate justice and the bold new steps member states set out at COP26 to ensure that climate action is gender responsive and that women can participate in meaningful climate action. Our work must be informed by the lived experiences of women and girls and the organizations that advocate for and with them. So we are very much looking forward to hearing your observations today. I would now like to invite the Secretary General to provide opening remarks. Once he has done so, we will open the floor for questions and answers. You may begin identifying yourselves in the Q&A tab at any time should you wish to take the floor. Please ensure that you provide your name, region you are joining from, and the name of your ECOSOC accredited organization. You can also choose to put a comment itself in Q&A space. I now invite the Secretary General to deliver his remarks.
Dear friends, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to all of you, wherever you are in the world. And allow me a first observation. I think we have a Q&A session, but I'm much more interested in listening to your opinions, to your suggestions, to your proposals, and even to your notes about the things that you believe we are not doing well than in a normal question and answer thing. I'm really interested in listening more than in talking, because that is the true nature of dialogue and participation. And it is a great pleasure to be here with all of you. The Town Hall during the Commission on the Status of Women is an important and regular fixture in my calendar. I never miss it. And I welcome this opportunity to meet with women's organizations and feminist civil society and to hear your ideas and concerns, as I've said. Let's be clear. Gender equality is essentially a question of power. And power has for millennia been concentrated in the hands of men to the detriment of all. The challenges we face today, the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, the growth and spread of conflicts, are largely the result of our male-dominated world and male-dominated culture. Without these, we would not have a war with Russia in the Ukraine. And that is why gender equality and gender parity are not only a matter of women's rights, but a fundamental prerequisite for a safer, more peaceful, and more sustainable world for all. And we cannot separate the perilous state of peace in our world from millennia of patriarchy and the suppression of women's voices. Even today, we see a widespread pushback against women's rights and gender equality around the world. When jobs are lost, they are often women's jobs. When rights are threatened, they are often gender-based rights. And we must push back against this pushback. And my recent report on our common agenda outlines 5 transformative actions to share power more equally. To repeal all laws everywhere that discriminate on grounds of gender, and we have it still practically all over the world. To achieve equal participation of women in all sectors and at all levels of decision-making, through special measures and quotas where necessary. Parity is essential to have good decision-making wherever, from the boards of companies to the governments to the UN. To invest in women's economic inclusion and address unpaid care work. And it's very interesting that we still have bias in the algorithms for credit distribution against women-led companies. This is something that needs to be eradicated. To center the voices and leadership of young women, the contribution of young women is more than necessary than ever when my generation is showing its inability to deal with the global challenges we have in the world. And finally, for every country to have a plan to end all forms of violence against women and girls. We have made progress on this, but we are far from reaching everywhere as we must. And of course, all these must be treated as the emergency that is backed by the laws, policies, and political will needed to achieve this goal. Taken together, the 5 actions I've just mentioned have the potential to radically transform societies and create the gender equal world we need. Dear friends, this year's Commission on the Status of Women comes at a moment where the world is facing emergencies on several fronts. The war in Ukraine is of great concern to us all, but that is just the latest crisis we face. We have chaotic coups and conflicts affecting multiple countries, from Mali to Ethiopia and Yemen. And we cannot be so concentrated. Of course, there is a human tragedy, a terrible tragedy in Ukraine, but we cannot be so concentrated on the Ukraine that we forget that people are suffering in so many other parts of the world, and the suffering of one human being has the same importance wherever that human being is. And the latest report by the International Panel on Climate Change was an atlas of human suffering, describing a horrific escalation of impacts that are hitting women and girls disproportionately. The continued unequal recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic is laying bare its severe impact on women's rights. The truth is that rich, developed countries have been able to spend trillions of dollars in their recovery. Those dollars are not available, or whatever other currency is not available for most of the poorest countries, and even many middle-income countries that are today in a dramatic debt trap and have not the capacity to provide for the well-being of their population, and women being the most sacrificed. So these are widespread and interlinked crises that affect us all, but not equally. More women than men have lost their jobs as the informal economy struggles to get back on its feet. The responsibility of unpaid care work continues to fall mainly on women and girls, with dire consequences for education, economic independence, and intergenerational poverty. Gender-based violence is an ongoing emergency in its own right. But despite all these challenges, women continue to advocate, to raise their voices for peace, equality, climate action, sustainable development, and human rights for all. Courageous women are in the streets of every continent, fighting for their rights and for more peaceful, inclusive, sustainable economies and societies that benefit us all. And so, dear friends, this year's priority theme at the Commissions on the Status of Women is achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. And this is more necessary than ever. This is essential for every community and every country. And as I made clear in my first ever report to the Commission on the issue, it is the greatest sustainable development challenge of our age. the triple planetary crises of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss pose an enormous threat to progress on women's rights and gender equality. Women and girls, particularly in small island developing states, are bearing the brunt of climate-related droughts, landslides, floods, and hurricanes. And the climate crisis is a human crisis and a women's rights crisis. The Paris Agreement is essential to protecting and advancing women's rights and gender equality, and climate action must include investing in women activists, human rights defenders, and civil society organizations. Dear friends, in my recent report on our common agenda, we have set out a series of proposals for a safer, more peaceful, equal, and sustainable world. Member States now will have to decide whether and how to take them forward. But I would like to stress that this is a feminist agenda based on equal power, participation, and leadership by men and women. We have heard overwhelming support for the specific actions on gender equality, and the United Nations will prioritize their full implementation. These proposals are rooted in existing agreements. They build on the momentum and commitments of the Beijing Platform and Agenda and the concrete achievements of the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And one of the proposals is to renew the social contract, to respond to today's social and economic needs, the climate and environmental crisis, the digital revolution, and the need for gender justice, among other factors. It's long overdue that our social and economic systems take full account of the unpaid care work and informal labor done mainly by women. Valuing this work is part of the broader proposal we have presented for metrics that complement gross domestic product, that doesn't reflect the reality of our societies. At the global level, our common agenda proposes a more inclusive networked multilateralism based on equal rights and opportunities for all. And inclusivity means full participation in equality by women and men. And the report recommends a new agenda for peace aimed at reducing violence in all its forms, including gender-based violence. And the new agenda for peace calls for women's participation and leadership in all peace efforts, taking the lead from the thinking developed and promoted by feminist civil society around women, peace and security. Our common agenda also recommits to the internal reforms needed to make the United Nations a global leader as a gender-equal organization. We have achieved gender parity among the senior leadership, 190 people, full gender parity 2 years ahead of schedule. And we have sustained and deepened these over the past 2 years. And we have also parity amongst the heads and deputy heads of missions for the first time. I remember when there was only one woman as deputy head of mission in the UN. Today, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in the DRC, in Central African Republic, we have women leading the UN efforts. That is something completely new in the history of the organization, as we are dealing with some of the most dramatic crises around the world, and we have reached parity on that. And I'm committed to achieving this goal across the organization at every level, in every entity, by 2028. But numbers are just one step. The entire United Nations system must be realigned to deliver for women and girls. And to this end, I've asked the Deputy Secretary General to oversee an independent review of the gender architecture of the entire United Nations family. I want to ensure that we are fit for purpose to deliver on gender equality. And we'll also build on the success of the Generation Equality Forum as a model of inclusive, networked multilateralism with women and girls at the center. Dear friends, I'm deeply concerned about the decline in civic space globally. According to one authoritative survey, just 3% of people around the world live in countries where civil society organizations can operate in full freedom. Civil society organizations link governments and people. They are a vital voice for human rights. When civil society is muzzled, we lose an essential forum for dialogue, and we lose the lifeblood of democracy. That is why I advocate at every possible opportunity for the protection and expansion of civic space. And women's rights organizations, young activists, and women environmental and human rights defenders must be able to play their full part everywhere. The work of civil society, including women activists and feminist groups, is also essential to the success of the United Nations, to our own success. And so this town hall is an important opportunity for me to hear from you and to engage with you directly as we pursue our common goals. Thank you, and I'm here to listen, and please see me as an ally as I look forward to hearing your views. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for your powerful words and for your continued strong allyship. I would now like to open up the floor for you to hear from participants directly. As a reminder, this is an open dialogue, and the SG would like to hear from you, not just questions, as he had told us earlier, but also your thoughts, your reflections, and your recommendations of how the UN can do better for women and for NGOs and for civil society. We will now open the floor for questions from civil society. Just to remind you again, to please identify yourself in the Q&A with your name, region, and organization's name. You can also type a message, a comment, or a question there. We will identify 3 of you at a time, and you will be elevated from participant to panelist to make your comment. If you will be asking a question or making a comment, please keep your microphones muted until I call upon you to speak. I ask that you please keep your questions short, keep your comments also short, so that we can ensure the SG gets to hear from as many of you as possible today. I would like to call first on Huri Gödelikian, Chair of NGO CSW, to be followed by Jevika Shiv, Asian Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women, to be followed by Tersila Rivera Zia from Religions for Peace. Please, I will give the floor now to Huri. Go ahead, Huri.
Thank you, Executive Director. Good to see you again. And thank you, Your Excellency, for that powerful opening message. You actually addressed... Oh.
In our discussions, there is even a fine of $1,000 for anyone that pronounces the Excellency. So you can call me António, you can call me SG, you can call me Secretary General, but Excellency, there is no one here that is an Excellency. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay. How could I forget? You did tell me. All right, I'll dive right in. I wanted to really thank you for that powerful opening message. You actually addressed a couple of issues that I want to bring up anyway, but we are making headway, right? And thank you for always giving us this opportunity. It is wonderful to be able to be in a room where we're discussing all of this. I want to highlight the fact that you did bring violence against women and gender-based violence as a cross-cutting issue in your common agenda. And we tried our best to include it in the methods of work this year. We had quite a few support from member states. We just quite didn't make it. And I suppose these small advancements are things to celebrate, right? Like we are advancing very slowly. But I want to really highlight a sentence that I have cut and pasted and I look at every day from your common agenda, where you say, it is an agenda of action designed to accelerate the implementation of existing agreements, including SDGs, and of course, Beijing Platform for Action. And I wanted to highlight that because we have so many great agreements already that we need to implement. And we are here to help, obviously, achieve that. And how do we really push for the implementation of that action? We need to really look into that closely. As chair of NGO Committee on Status of Women, I am proud to report we were able to organize yet another virtual forum along with our global activists. This year, we were able to accelerate our advocacy work thanks to CSW Bureau. We have a very strong bureau this year, and UN Women in some member states. But we are still grappling, as you mentioned, with violence, war, and the remnants of a global pandemic that we are still not sure of its ramifications. United Nations is the space where we should be able to find solutions. My first question, How can we add more pressure on member states who are ultimately responsible to work with us, civil society, to improve and elevate global status? This is the question we bring up every year, and we need to really keep improving on it. We also recommend a women's circle of peace to make sure women are at the table during peace negotiations. Women also need to be at the table when discussing climate solutions. You mentioned this as well. They are on the ground helping already. Leaders alone can't discuss solutions without them. We can't be sidelined anymore. We are being killed by war, climate, disasters. Let's make 1325 and all the other agreements a living document that we use in all our discussions. My final question, which I'm also glad that you brought up, is the gender architecture at UN. Is civil society involved in these discussions? We can imagine the pushback, and I'm so grateful for what you have achieved already in gender parity at the levels that you mentioned. What can we do to help bring civil society voices in that process? We are not going to give up on crushing patriarchy and diminishing militarism. Even the most gender blind human, apologies, can see it is not bringing us to peace, prosperity, or real change. Let's work together to find solutions. We are here to help. And thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Huri. I now give the floor to Jevika. Please go ahead, Jevika.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Good morning, good evening to everyone. I am Jivika. I'm from India, and I'm part of the young feminist spaces and movements, and also a national gender youth advocate to UN Women. Thank you so much for creating this open dialogue where we can actually speak about, both recommendations and issues, especially coming from a young person's perspective. So I just wanted to ask, and I know I've had dialogues with Sima ma'am as well about this, about how do we center youth in such spaces, especially youth who come from marginalized communities, who come from different castes, from different racial, ethnic groups, and how do we create more space in UN systems, especially on youth working on gender and human rights, and institutionalize and formalize these spaces. We have heard of a UN envoy's office, but how do we also move beyond that to creating more diverse multiple spaces for youth to engage with these processes? And our initial engagement with UN Women, both at the local and global level, coming from India and at the global level working with UN Women, has been that we have been able to bring in much more of a youth perspective the minute youth have a seat at the table. But also, how do we now move from just having a seat at the table to co-creating, co-leading, also being accountable in the system? So that's one question that I have for you. How do we see this cross-cutting, as my co-traveler Huri said, across the system, so that gender is just not limited to one system, but young feminist leadership is driving what the UN actually moves forward towards? And that brings me to my second question, that, both this question of young human rights defenders, especially from the area that I'm coming from, and the question of marginalized groups and marginalized youth, how do we center them in the discourse, especially coming from the women farmers movement in India and from the climate change movement in India? I see that there is a need to center youth in these discourses, especially discourses around the global south and development. So how do we do that from a gendered lens, and what is the vision of the Secretary General's office to actually mainstream and gender young people in this discourse? And also, finally, I would be really happy to share that we have been able to bring 30 global consultations as part of the CSW dialogues, and bring together youth recommendations around climate change, gender, and looking at the and some of us have also engaged with different spaces like COP, like UNFCCC, the SDGs office on climate change. And we hope to see mainstreaming of these agendas in the SDGs. And I'd be happy to share them with all of you, and hope that you can also take them into the discussions that you have with your advisory body, where colleagues of mine like Archana also sit. So just hoping to hear from you on these three aspects of mainstreaming youth and especially youth working on gender and human rights. How do we also bring in marginalized youth, especially those from lower caste backgrounds, because caste is not spoken about? And how do we do this at a holistic level at the UN? Thank you so much for giving me the space to ask you this.
Thank you, Javika. I now give the floor to Tersila. Please go ahead.
Muchísimas gracias, señora directora ejecutiva de ONU.
Thank you very much, Executive Director of UN Women. And first of all, I would like to make a plea for peace in the world, Secretary General. And thank you very much for this space. We need peace in the world, in life, and in our bodies as well. I'm going to be very specific, Secretary General. As an indigenous woman, I'm an activist for the rights of indigenous women and peoples, and we're going to ask for your help so that in areas where we discuss rights and the eradication of violence, the quest for equality, we could take into account the collective rights of indigenous peoples and also the rights of indigenous women, girls and young women. When we talk about climate change, we have to put ourselves in that context. When we talk about compliance with the SDGs, Agenda 2030, sustainable development, an indigenous woman without land, without access to resources, without a full life, cannot have a sustainable life. And that is why quite simply ask for your help, your intermediation, yourself or UN Women, so that in all situations we can understand that dimension of the collective rights as a people and the individual rights of indigenous women, because we don't want to continue talking about violence, violations, adolescent pregnancy, land expulsions, or always being mentioned as extreme poverty or described as extreme poverty. We are in a situation of vulnerability due to the impact of climate change or due to situations that are created by other agents. But Secretary General, as you know, we have knowledge, we have contributions, both for mitigation as well as adaptation when it comes to climate change. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Secretary General, would you like to answer?
Thank you very much. First of all, the colleague of the CSW Forum, thank you very much for your comments. I'm in full agreement with everything you said. And I would like to make, in relation to the comments, questions that you presented, to say a few things. First, I fully agree that we do not need to invent new things. In the majority of the situations, we just need to make sure that what has been decided, what has been agreed, is implemented. And so our common agenda is, we see it as something to boost the implementation of the kind of agreements that we had, from Beijing to climate, to Paris Agreement, to the SDGs, and we could go on and on, to the human rights conventions, and the call for human rights that I made. What is clear is that in most of these areas, we are not moving ahead, we are moving backwards. We are moving backwards because of the circumstances. I mean, we live in a world that is systemically unequal. I mean, all the rules of our economic system were defined by rich countries to the benefit of rich countries. And so the present situation is increasing dramatically inequalities. And in this increase of inequalities between North and South, or within societies, between rich and poor, we have women suffering more than anyone else. And so we need to recognize that what we have achieved is suffering a pushback by the circumstances, by the systemic problems of our societies, and pushed back by the political will of authoritarian regimes and others that take profit of this situation to stifle, to try to shut up the voices and the organizations of civil society. So we need to push back on the pushback, and we need to make sure that we launch with the common agenda a way to revert this backwards trend that we are having at the present moment. And this is indeed our philosophy. And we believe the gender question is essential. Because one of the reasons we are where we are is because, as I said in my intervention, we still live in a male-dominated society. I mean, G7, 7 presidents or prime ministers, all men. G20, 20 presidents or prime ministers, all men. What can you expect of a body of decision in which women are not represented? Can we expect balance? Can we expect equilibrium? Can we expect diversity in the different contributions? Of course not. And this is this male-dominated world we need to fight against. Because it's very important to support civil society in all its aspects. It's very important to do everything you can in the UN. But I repeat, this is a question of power, and power is never given. It has to be grabbed. And there are some innocent men that are allies in this. Use them. I try to be more feminist as much as I can. But use some men that have understood that this is what leads to wars. I mean, this is what leads to inability to distribute vaccines equitably. This is what leads to the inability to, have a clear commitment to fight climate change. Is because of this male-dominated world. And so, we need to fight. And you can count me as an ally in relation to the civil society struggle in the very difficult circumstances that we face. And that is why we are creating now a focal point in all departments to be able to give the civil society more direct forms of intervention in the processes that take place in the UN system. So all departments will have a focal point, and the focal point will also be committed to support civil society in the developing world. Because, in many developed countries, we have very strong organizations of the civil society, NGOs that have a lot of impact in the global discussions. But, we need to have those that represent the civil society in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, to have a much stronger role, because they are the ones that are suffering more the consequences of the kind of inequalities that I have described. And so we are totally committed to move in that direction. And the same applies to youth. And I want to thank Ms. Jessica for her words. You speak so quickly that I'm not sure I was able to capture everything, Ms. Jessica. So if I don't respond effectively, I apologize. But we had in the public sphere until now 2 times. 1 time or 3 times. 1 time was where people wouldn't care at all about the role of youth in the public sphere. Then there was a 2nd time in which people understood that, leaders understood that it's better to take the youth into account, and so they established mechanisms of communication and propaganda to the youth. The 3rd moment, at a certain moment, they understood that this was not working, and so they created mechanisms to listen to the voice of youth in some fora that usually were marginal in relation to decision-making processes, but at least there was this impression that people were listening to the youth. Now we need to move into the 4th phase, and the 4th phase is where youth effectively participates in decision-making processes. And that is why we want in the UN, we have, as you mentioned, our special envoy. She has been doing a fantastic job, but now we want it to be embedded in the UN work. And that's why we want, because the youth appears as a kind of a peripheral aspect of the work of all the different areas of the UN. Now we want to have a UN office for youth that is concentrating on making and creating the conditions for effective participation of youth in the decision-making processes of the UN and to influence member states to move in that direction. And we will be doing everything we can in this regard to put pressure and use the Human Rights High Commissioner to put pressure on the protection of young women, human rights activists, and to put pressure on states. And that was the other question that was asked, how to put pressure on states. I think to put pressure on states, we need to build coalitions of the willing. We need to see who in societies and who in the international community can be allies, and we need to aggregate them, we need to coordinate them, and we need to make them have a stronger voice in the context of, namely, the countries where we still have a very strong patriarchal mechanism of decision. And it's amazing how we can find allies and how we can federate them when we really are committed to it. We see it in the civil society. We are starting to see it in some areas of the private sector, and we see it in many people involved in politics that now understand that parity is an essential element for good political direction. Now, I would like to thank Mr. Sila for her plea for peace, and to say that we have unfortunately not yet stopped an historic trend of sacrificing indigenous peoples to the so-called progress or modernity. I mean, look at the past, what has happened I'm in the United States, what has happened to indigenous communities in the United States, what has happened in Canada, what has happened in Australia, what has happened in many other countries around the world. Unfortunately, what we are seeing now is that now that we all pretend we are civilized, the same pressure on indigenous populations is still taking place to clear, like some like to say, to clear some areas for progress, for investment, for whatever, not taking into account the fact that the indigenous communities are today, where they still prevail, the best allies of climate action. There is no meaningful pollution in areas where indigenous communities prevail. There is no emissions of meaningful emissions of carbon in those communities. There is no biodiversity loss in those communities. And so those communities need to be seen not as something that needs to be sacrificed for an old vision of progress, but an essential element in the construction of a new vision of progress. And so we will be doing our best to support indigenous communities and to put pressure on governments to understand that it is the contribution of indigenous communities that is more necessary than ever, instead of the sacrifice of indigenous communities in the name of completely outdated, sometimes criminal visions of what progress means.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Secretary General. I would now like to call on the three next speakers, Antonia Kirkland from Equality Now, Suli Mwajra, Outright International, and Erin Harden from International Disability Alliance. Ms. Antonia, you have the floor.
Hello, warm greetings from Equality Now, and thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Antonia, although sometimes I got called Antonio, which I don't mind too much. But I just wanted to note that only 12 countries have achieved full legal equality, according to the World Bank's Women Business and the Law Group, and climate justice and many other issues are inextricably linked to legal equality, which is foundational and fundamental to gender equality generally. And as you noted, ending discriminatory laws is a major part of your common agenda, as well as your call to action on human rights. So what more can we do at the global level to get states to finally eliminate all the sex discriminatory laws, and in particular, around family laws, which are very tricky because they involve religion, custom, and tradition. And secondly, I wanted to ask what we can do to address inequality online, where there's very uneven and inconsistent regulation and no real universal standard of equality. Thank you so much.
Antonia, Suli, please, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. My name is Tuli Mjwacha from Inclusive and Affirming Ministries. ECOSOC is outright international. And I'm speaking on behalf of the LGBTI Caucus, an informal coalition of over 300 representatives from every region of the world working to advance gender equality internationally, regionally, nationally, and locally. I want to start, I want to start to thank you, Secretary General and UN Women, for holding this town hall today during CSW66. I also want to take a moment. I also want to take a moment in solidarity with all of those who are being affected by conflict in Ukraine around the globe right now. We must recognize that lesbian, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and gender non-conforming women, girls, and people continue to be amongst those most vulnerable and disproportionately affected by climate change, including through exclusion, violence, discrimination, and barriers to accessing programs that respond to and prevent climate disasters. Therefore, all strategies addressing the climate crisis must be gender just, human rights framed, and transformative to promote gender equality as outlined in the Beijing Declaration, and must leave no one behind and tackle the structural causes of inequality and marginalization affecting all women and girls. We are in an important moment where we are first discussing climate change at CSW at the Agenda 2030 Decade of Action and seeing your work for our common agenda. We understand that no real change can be made when some populations are left behind. In that light, what can the Secretary General's office and the UN as a whole do to ensure that everything in building back better agenda and climate action responses are inclusive of all, and more specifically of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and queer communities? Thank you.
Sorry, do you mind your last phrase? The common agenda to be inclusive of all and especially of?
That is inclusive of all and more specifically of LGBTIQ persons.
Okay, very well.
Thank you.
Secretary General, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. From Antonio to Antonia. You mentioned the aspect of religion and the questions of family laws. And I have to say that there is a lot of work we all need to do in dialogue with religious leaders. I am Catholic. And when I read the gospel, I see clearly a perspective of gender equality. And the episode of the adulterous woman is typical because when Christ said, "Those that have the conscience clean will throw the first stone," and as there were men around, which means that the adultery by a woman has the same value as the adultery by a man. So this is completely revolutionary in the culture of those times. I mean, and indeed, we have in several religions a confusion in the way religious leaders act today between what are the core principles of the religion and what are the things in which the religion is adapted to the specific circumstances of the societies at that time. It's very interesting to see that, for instance, when we look at Afghanistan and we look at many of the rules that the Taliban tried to impose, they have nothing to do with the Quran. They have all to do with the traditions of that people and extreme male chauvinism of the Afghan society since many centuries. So we need to engage with religious leaders, and we need to, in that engagement, and of course the Catholic Church has this problem that women are not yet sacerdotes, which means that we have no bishops that are women in the Catholic Church, and we have no chance to have a pope that is a woman. But in other religions, things are different, and we have women and men. But we need to really discuss seriously with religious leaders, because there is nothing in the core of religious principles that is against gender equality. And so to invoke religion against gender equality is something that is totally unacceptable. And then your second point was inequality. Sorry, because I can't. My end is not. I can't. Inequality. António, do you mind please coming back? Your second point
was how can we address inequality online, the violence and discrimination?
Online, that's it. I wasn't able to read online. I think that we have one serious problem there. Power relations that have been slowly evolving in favor to women during at least the last century, there is a risk of revert those power relations because of the technological sectors and the digital world. Mm-hmm. We still have a male-dominated presence in the universities, in engineering courses, in technological courses, and in scientific professions. And when one looks at these digital platforms and digital companies, and we look at the algorithms they developed, their algorithms have a gender bias. They have also racial bias, there are other things, but there is a gender bias. I'll give you a concrete example here from the United States. A couple, a man and a woman that were a couple. The woman was more wealthy than the man, and they both went to open two bank accounts and to ask for credit cards for those bank accounts. The woman was wealthier than the man. The man got a credit card with a higher ceiling than the woman. And when they asked, why is it? The answer of the employee of the bank was, well, this is the result of the algorithm. So the algorithms are being constructed in Silicon Valley and the other Silicon Valleys of this world that are now, I would say, a center of male chauvinism. These algorithms are being constructed in a way that is gender biased and in a way that is also biased in relation to racial aspects. And there is a lot that could be said about it, but I mean, it's not for today. We need to have more and more women in technological professions. We need to have more and more women in the engineering schools and in scientific centers. And we need at the same time in regulations, and this is a role for governments, we need to have regulations that undermine this possibility of having gender-biased algorithms that automatically create gender inequality in a number of decisions that are taken and in a number of processes that are put in place. And on the other hand, we need to have a strong campaign against false information. We have, as you know, in the UN, we launched the Verify about the COVID. We need to do a lot to put good information on the web and to make the platforms responsible for what they publish. I mean, a newspaper is responsible for what is published in the newspaper. These platforms are not responsible for what appears, and this is something is a legal loophole that needs to be addressed, and this is a big fight. But we are building slowly a coalition of allies, and that is why we want a global compact in order to make sure that we effectively address these questions. I would like to thank Ms. Tully for his comments. There were more comments than real questions, but what for me is clear, when one looks at climate change and when one looks at the transformative policies in relation to gender in the context of the common agenda, I think what makes the common agenda, and sorry to say that because I was largely involved in it, what makes the common agenda particularly interesting is the holistic vision of these things. I mean, we cannot look into climate action without looking into gender equality. We cannot look into the reform of the financial system without looking into gender equality. We cannot look into the global public goods, health, education, social protection, without looking into gender equality. So gender equality is something that in the common agenda, independently of the specific actions that I mentioned, the 5 points, is something that permeates all the different proposals in all different sectors, because we sincerely do not believe that with male-dominated structures, we will be effective against climate, we will be effective against inequality, we will be effective in peace promotion, we will be effective in mediation. And obviously, one of the things that were mentioned by one of the friends is that women have still a very small role in mediation. We are working now in helping the networks of women mediators, namely in the African context, and in our own mediation teams and in the mediation, the high-level panel on mediation, we have gender parity, and we are doing everything we can to make sure that that translates itself into an effective presence of women in peace processes. But there, I must tell you, in many of these crises that we are witnessing, there is a huge male predominance, and that is the reason why these crises are almost impossible to solve, and they go on and on and on and on without an effective solution. Now, when we mean inclusive of everybody. We mean no discrimination in relation to anybody. And of course, this includes the LGBTIQ+. We have, inside the UN, we have a group that is particularly engaged in these issues. There is a very strong dialogue between the UN management and this group. And I believe that if you look at, for instance, the last survey that we had for the UN staff, that I believe it was entirely correct in relation to the adequate treatment of questions related to not only sexual orientation, but the new vision about gender. So I would say that we are totally committed to it, and we use all our influence in the context of our call for human rights for that to be present in all policies and in all actions of the UN, but more than that, to put pressure on member states. But there I must tell you, we face a pushback at the present moment in a number of very important member states that are creating a lot of difficulties in our work. So we do in the Secretariat and in the agencies, we do things as we try to do it in the right way. But when it involves a discussion of member states, we face a very difficult environment.
Thank you, Secretary General. We have been told that we can go a few minutes over time, so we can take one last round. This last round would have two people. Please, I'm going to call on you. Sanhur Rahman, Men Engaged, and Patricia Watimina from Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development. So please try to be brief also, but his Secretary General is listening. Go ahead.
Hello, Secretary General. My name is Sanhur Rahman from Bangladesh, working with Men Engage Alliance. So I want to thank you for your establishment of the Youth Advisory Panel for United Nations to tackling climate change. So what do you think that member state can establish that kind of advisory panel to ensure not only meaningful participation, also leadership, ownership to tackle climate crisis? And what is your thought to ensuring young people's, especially young women's participation in the negotiation process? Thank you.
Thank you. Patricia?
Thank you so much, Sima, and thank you so much, Host Secretary General. Yeah, I'm Patricia Watimena, and I'm with the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development. I have two concrete points here. I'm calling in from New York. I hope you can, am I audible? Are you okay? You can hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you very well.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm calling here.
Please speak slowly, okay? Because the sound is not fantastic.
Okay.
And I want to be able to understand everything you say.
Thank you. So I'm calling in here from New York. So from APWLD, my organization, we are based in Thailand. There are a team of two. We are coming here despite all the uncertainties, months of uncertainties about the participation during the CSW66. Just last Saturday, we got your letter saying that finally CSOs can enter the UN again. So for us, this is something that is very concerning because this is exactly one of the ways how a lot of organizations, women's organizations in the global south, especially our women from the community are not able to come here at the CSW. We are really seeing CSW, as a critical space for us, especially as it is taking forward a very, very critical issues. We are talking about climate crisis. And as we are talking about the climate crisis here, the global negotiation is ongoing. Our women on the ground is really living the climate catastrophe. That's their daily reality. So that is something that we feel we want to express with you. And then now there is an access to the UN building, but with this, we want to chat with you and then also, of course, UN Women. As the daily proceeding continues, and especially the negotiations, we would want to see that from tomorrow, we would have official information and then clear information also from the UN regarding our participation in the negotiation, especially as an organization with EXOC status. But moving forward also, CSW66, for us is really a space where we really need to voice out the challenges and situations of women, especially in the global south. And then I want to also ask you, Mr. Secretary General, about, we have been hearing about a pushback at the CSW66 that we are not renegotiating HOP. But that is exactly what we are not saying either. We are here not to renegotiating HOP, but we are here to really looking at the systemic and structural barriers of the climate crisis. And then as the CSW is ongoing, we feel that there is a critical need for CSW to really more ambitious with its feminist climate justice agenda. And then in the agreed conclusion, we want to see how CSW is addressing loss and damage that is a matter of life and death for women on the ground, and then also climate finance with feminist leadership. We, as a part also of co-conveners in the Women's Rights Caucus, we have our concrete policy recommendations. That's something that we can share with UN Women also, and then with everyone. One last thing that I want to share is that I believe that this part of global negotiations, we are talking, and then I've been hearing you talking a lot about gender equality, how is mass patriarchy, how we really, really fight, because we see that it is everywhere. I believe that CSW really needs to also dismantle and address the root causes of climate injustices. So seeing climate injustices and gender injustices as not two different things, because they are really interrelated. So, Mr. Secretary General, I want to see your your views on these two things. First is about the participation and the clarity of the participation as the negotiation is ongoing. Secondly is about how we can see more, progressive, more ambitious agenda of CSW through its agreed conclusion. by the end of the negotiation. Thank you so much, Sima and Mr. Secretary General. Over to you.
Mr. Secretary General, I understand that Erin Hardin did not get an opportunity to speak, so I would like to call on her for the last comment in this segment. Erin, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning to all and good morning to Secretary General. I'm calling in from the New York office of the International Disability Alliance. I wanted to ask how you see the UN disability inclusion strategies importance for the inclusion of women and girls with disabilities in the context of climate change. Thank you.
Secretary General.
Thank you very much. First of all, to Sonur, how can we have young people in decision-making processes? Well, we are doing a large effort. That is the reason why we are creating the office. So we want, through the office of youth office, we want to create channels, the office being active in all activities of the UN. We want to create channels to organize the participation of young people in the different aspects of the action of the UN. But obviously, there is a central question here, which is some governments are already understanding that they need to have young people in political positions, that they need to have young people in decision-making positions. And that is what is more complicated with UN rules and regulations, but I'll be doing my best to really shake those rules and regulations. I've been trying to shake them in many aspects, but we have a very conservative approach when we deal with, the member states in relation to those questions. But indeed, one thing that is vital is to have in the political organizations and in the different civil society organizations, young people in their leadership groups, because without it, just auscultation is not enough. That's what auscultation was, the third phase. We need to move into the fourth phase, which is effective presence of young people where decisions are taken. Now, dear colleague Patricia, I'm fully in favor of the largest possible forms of participation in the CSW. And of course, there are a number of political questions within the UN, but as a general principle, we are interested in the maximum form of participation. And we believe that in relation to climate, I'll give you an example. Today, all UN staff, male UN staff, refuse to participate in panels when women are not present. So we are putting pressure for the organizations in which we are part to make sure that there is effective women presence in the activities in which we participate. But there is a long way to go in relation to, I would say, only 15% of ministers of environment in the world are women. So this is a battle, a battle in every society, in every country, to make sure that we have women in positions of power in the questions related to climate. And we'll be doing everything we can to support it. Now, I have to say that one of our biggest concerns in relation to what Ms. Erin has expressed, one of our biggest concerns is how to make the world understand that the question of people with disability is not a minor question, a peripheral question. We believe there is more than 1 billion people, and that, as problems of disability. And if you take the families of these people, we are dealing with something that really affects a large part of the world's population. And so the question of how to ensure that people with disability can fully participate in the labor market, in the political processes, in the UN, different organizations, is a central question. Now, we have the strategy, we are pushing as much as we can, but I have to say a lot of obstacles are still there. I mean, I remember that the General Assembly of the United Nations was confronted with the fact that the president of Ecuador was coming and there was no way to bring him to the podium. So finally, we did what is necessary, and now we have conditions for access to the podium. But just to say that we need to put these questions in the center of those that do urban planning, in the center of the concerns of those that do construction of whatever kind of equipment in whatever place. We need to look into these in relation to policies of research of different kinds of things, from the digital world to the automotive world to all kinds of other aspects of human activity, to have equipment and to have processes in which people with disability can fully participate. This is a central question, and I would lie if I would say that we have done enough. We are far from doing enough. And even in the UN, this has not yet received the full priority it deserves. And I'll do everything I can in the second mandate to make sure that we really bring this into the front line of our activity. But I have to apologize. We did not do enough in relation to this in the first mandate, but we were probably not sufficiently aware of the level of obstacles that exist, physical obstacles, but psychological aspects and political obstacles. But now I think we have a more clear perspective, and I think we'll be able to fight in a more effective way.
Thank you, Secretary General, for joining us today and for your strong and very clear support, as well as the priority you continue to place on engaging in dialogue with women's civil society organizations and in also engaging with them on the many issues that the UN is close to the heart of the UN, but also close to the heart and the work of civil society. I know that we have not been able to get all of the questions today, given the limitations of time, although we took some time, a bit more time, and we thank you for that. But in line with previous years, UN Women will compile all comments and questions submitted to share with you, and we will then circulate your responses in writing to all our network of ECOSOC accredited NGOs. So let me hand back over to you, SG, for your final words.
Well, my final words are very simple. I mean, this is indeed a question of power, so we need to fight. And we need to use all possible instruments to break the coalition that is there to maintain a male-dominated world in a male-dominated culture. And we need to fight in all sectors. And we need to dismantle all obstacles. And we need to raise our voices clearly in all circumstances and to support those that risk their freedom and their life because they are not able to raise their voices freely in the countries where they work. They will need to have our full solidarity and our full support. Thank you very much to all of you, and good success in all the activities of your different organizations, because we have a common objective, a common cause, and we are still far from winning, but we will be united, making progress as quickly as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary General. Thank you. Thank you all, dear friends, and goodbye.